Good. Always a pleasure to kenos as kol Yehudim, or at least some of the Yehudim, to learn some Torah before Purim. I'll tell you the truth. When I was going through the Megillah this year, there were certain themes and certain elements that really, I think, really based on just what we're all experiencing now together, that there's certain themes really just popped out at me that didn't usually have as much of a, or at least created a certain significance that I didn't realize before. So I want to try to highlight a few themes, but really focus on the main one, which is the title of this year, which is the world is changing. The world is changing, and you see characters in the Megillah kind of reinvent themselves from who they were to thinking differently and acting differently and sacrificing a lot, as we will see along the way. But even before we get there, there's a couple of things. We know one of the main messages of the Purim story of the Megillah, right? Top two themes. Go ahead. What do you think? Number one, anyone?
Who wants to annihilate the Jews?
Yeah, that's, I don't know, such a crazy idea, right? Yeah. I would say, like, number one theme of the Megillah is like finding Hashem in the world, right? Where we're constantly, it's actually a beautiful idea, which is very deep. You have Chanukah and Purim are like the twin Chagim because they're two rabbinic ones, two holidays that were added to Rabbanan. Purim is like a supernatural one where the oil lasted for extra days. My father borrowed my car when he was in town, and he first thing he did was go fill it up. He's like, "What do you expect? Like the Chanukah miracle?" He's like, "Your tank was below empty." I said the E doesn't stand for empty; it stands for emunah. Yeah. So but I got a full tank out of it, so it worked. Yeah. but it happened in a supernatural way. And in Purim, classically, God's name doesn't appear in the Megillah, and if you read the story superficially, which we're not supposed to, at least we're supposed to see past the superficialities. It really just is a story about changing political tides and Jewish advocacy and Jewish pride and Jewish ability to push forward, Jewish courage and bravery. That's really what it is on a superficial level. So, on Megillah, on Chanukah, the custom which prevails is we spin the dreidel, right? But on Purim, we shake the grager, right? So on Chanukah, we spin from the top. We're spinning something from the top, like Hashem showed us He was in the world, right? He showed us the miracles. But on Purim, we spin from the bottom because it's really us that brought about the miracle. In Hasidic literature, this is what we call hitarusa de le'ela, when kind of Hashem splits the sea, right? Or hitaruta de le'tata, when the Jewish people have courage and bravery and we push forward. And obviously we recognize that we couldn't have done it without Him, capital H, but we were the ones who pushed forward, right? So Purim, I think for us, is really, in many ways, the most relevant and pertinent Chag, and the story of the Megillah, more than anything else in Tanakh, really hits us home, because we could see ourselves as a Mordechai, as an Esther. We could see ourselves in that position. We know what it's like when a global leader changes from now pro-Israel or helping Jews out. Like, things could change on a dime, just from one king to the next, as we'll talk about in the context of the. So there's so many pertinent messages that I want to try to bring out, given the changing world that we're living through now. And the first one, which I think is maybe the number two theme in Megillah, is Jewish unity. In other words, our enemies know something that it takes us a lot longer to learn than our enemies. Our enemies know very well that when we are factioned off and arguing with each other, we're extremely vulnerable. And when we have achdus and unity, we're unstoppable. That's like our Achilles heel. Because it's really hard for us to do. When we do it, we're impossible to beat. And when we're falling into the infight and factions and not getting along with one another, then we are extremely, extremely vulnerable. It's amazing. I heard this from Sapir Cohen. Ever read or heard her story? Sapir Cohen is a released hostage. Her stories are just so inspiring, so unbelievable. She's one of these hostages who found her faith in the tunnels of Gaza. As crazy as it sounds, but it's almost like a trend how many of these hostages were able to reinvigorate or even discover for the first time the concept of God and the concept of brachos, the concept of prayer, from Gaza. Sapir Cohen shared a chilling story. She said while she was in captivity, her captives, Hamas captors, showed her a video of Hostage Square. Thousands of Jews there. It was some commemorating 100 days, some marker, some marker in time that everyone forgot about their differences to come together for the plight of the hostages. And he looked at Sapir Cohen and he said, "See, they're all getting together. All we have to do now, we can't attack. We're going to wait till all that stops, and your nation will start fighting with each other. We're going to do another October 7th then." This guy is not necessarily he's not making the calls, but he was explaining a sentiment to Sapir Cohen. He's saying that when you're together, when you see this video of Hostage Square, sure, we can't attack you. When you guys are fighting about judicial reform and faction and talks, your enemies start talking about civil war, that's when we come in. And you know who knew this way before Hamas? Huh? Amalek, aka Haman, right? Haman. How are we described in the Megillah? Haman's first description, he says Mafuzar Mafurid Bein Ha'amim, right? That there's, again, superficially, we always have to look past that in the Megillah. It's the whole game of the Megillah is to look past it. But superficially, Haman was just basically saying that there's this nation, that there's a pocket of them here, pocket of them there, and they're not really culturally the same as us, and they're not listening to your edicts. But on a deeper level, Haman was describing that we were not connected to one another. And when's the tipping point? The tipping point is we'll get to this scene a little bit more in a few moments, but when Mordechai comes to Esther and says, you have to go to Achashverosh and you have to advocate on our behalf. You're in the right position to do this. There's no one else in the world that could do what you could do right now. And she said, no, I don't know, right? She wavers, but at the end of the day, she says, you know what, fine, Mordechai, let's do this together. What command did she give Mordechai? She said, I'll do my part. You got to do your part. What's your part? Lech kenos es kol haYehudim, right? Gather the Jewish people. And again, superficially, get them all together on a loudspeaker and tell them all to fast. But on a deeper level, gather the Jewish people. Forget about your differences and figure out some mission statement that is more important than our differences. So really, the story of Purim, of the Megillah, we could summarize accurately from this vantage point is it's a shift from being fractured to being united. When we're fractured, our enemies, Haman, they knock us down like dominoes. It was so easy when we were fractured to talk to Achashverosh and advocate against us, and we were like house of cards, right? But when we united, miracles happened, again, within nature, through successful advocacy, and Mordechai and Esther were able to bring about the salvation. So I think that's, number one, something that we've seen, a very powerful shift, and maybe now we're seeing the shakiness in that invigorated unity that we had right after October 8th, and it's something that we can't control how other Jews think about other Jews. Like, we can't solve the political factions within Israel, but we could look at our own lives and we could really do our part in achdus and unity in our community, in our families, and realize that there is so much more that unites us than divides us. I think that's number one, something that struck out at me as something which is, based on the experience that we're having now. The second element which really stuck out at me is actually Rabbi Popko spoke beautifully under the chuppah 2 nights ago, and he mentioned this to the Chassan and the Kala, Benji and Eliana, and I thought it was a very, very powerful element. There's a scene there that, again, when Esther is wavering and saying, I don't know if I could go into Achashverosh, Mordechai has a line there. And before we read Mordechai's line, let's pretend we're Mordechai for a second, right? Esther, you've got to do this, because if you don't, right, I would have said the Jewish people will be annihilated. Like, Haman's going to get his way. We're going to be done for it. Mordechai says the exact opposite, pretty much. What does he say? He says, Revach v'atzala yamod liYehudim b'makom acher. You don't want to bring about the salvation. You don't want the zechus. You don't want the merit to be the axis that the story will revolve around for the rest of Jewish history. Fine. It's going to come about somewhere else. And Rabbi Claman didn't go in this direction, but was so powerful to me when I realized that, is that Mordechai knew the end of the story before it happened. He knew what the last chapter said. He didn't know what all the chapters said in between. He didn't know how the last chapter would come about, but he knew with absolute confidence, with absolute, not empty, but emunah, he knew that the Jewish people were going to be okay after this. There will be maybe a lot of pain, a lot of suffering along the way, but he knew what the last chapter of the book said. I remember, I believe it was even before October 7th, I shared, it was over a Pesach, and I shared an idea that I had for a film script. And I have actually lots of yichus in Hollywood, the Clamans. If you type in Claman in the Hollywood, like IMBD, you'll find a lot of my cousins, okay? June Claman, Alei Hashalom, born in Jensen, Saskatchewan, okay? Makes Edmonton look like a metropolitan, okay? Tiny little hamlet in Canada, and she passed away in Beverly Hills, 90210. And she was an actress, and her kids, one of her daughters, Barbara Claman, is the first chair violinist of the Hollywood Symphony Orchestra, which means every single person in this room has heard my cousin play violin, because every late night show, every music score, every TV show, like 90% Monopoly, is she's playing. She was second chair on Schindler's List, behind, Yitzhak Perlman. Yeah, but when he kind of retired from the Symphony Orchestra, so she is literally first chair in like every music score we've heard of. Incredible career. So anyways, as we digress, I had an idea for a music script. Maybe I should call my cousins and pitch it to them. But I think it's a great idea. Imagine this kid who's suffering. It's like a sci-fi type of thing, so bear with me, right? This kid has a very difficult life. Orphaned at a young age, grew up in an orphanage and was passed around from house to house as a teenager, 3 schools in 4 years. Like, it's just a difficult upbringing, hard to get into adulthood, his first job, everything. The currents were going against him all the time. But before his father passed away, he gave him this book. It's a magical book. And as he lives his life, the chapters are filling themselves in. But the one thing he could always do is flip to the last chapter. That was always there. And the last chapter talks about him in his 40s with his beautiful wife and his stable job and his mental equilibrium, emotional equilibrium, and his children, successful, obviously all in medical school. One's already a doctor, right, a specialist, right? And the last chapter just describes, what we would call Yiddish utopia, just a perfect Yiddish nachas. So while he opens the page and what's past tense is there, chapter 1, 2, 3, his father died, everything is there. But when he opens up to present tense, that chapter is empty. And as he makes his decisions and choices, and as he gets hurt and fallbacks, and he loses trust in people, all that's being written in real time. And it's really difficult. And sometimes he wants to give up. But he could always just flip to the last chapter and read that. So he doesn't know how he's getting there, but he knows he's getting there, right? That is, to me, we are living this sci-fi, because we have the Nevi'im. If we learn Sefer Yeshaya and we learn Sefer, we know that what's happening right now is a fulfillment of the Nevi'im, the Kibbutz Galuyos, and then we'd be taken away from the land and back to the land, and we're going to rebuild the third and final Beis Hamikdash. It's all there, and everything else they said in past tense has been written in history of facts already. So now we just have a few more chapters. It's very difficult. We're living through difficult times, but we have to be able to know that we have that chapter at the end that we could flip. Mordechai had that chapter. If he didn't have that chapter, if he didn't have that emunah, that faith, that it's all going to be okay in the end, and if it's not okay yet, it's just not the end yet. I think that was Yoki, what's her name? John Lennon's girlfriend or wife? Yoko, and I think she's the first one that said, it'll all be okay in the end, and if it's not okay yet, it's not the end yet. I think she said that. Fact check me later. Okay, thank you. Okay. So, Mordechai had that last chapter. If he didn't have that last chapter, he would say, Esther, if you don't go, we're all toast. But he didn't say that. He said, if you don't go, okay, you're giving up your ability, your opportunity to be a protagonist in the story, which is going to bring us to the last chapter. If it's not you, it's going to be someone else. But I know we're going to get out of this. Amalek doesn't win at the end of the book. Flip. Amalek's gone. Jewish people are there. Right? It's a fact. We know it from our Nevi'im. We know it from our prophets. Mordechai know it, and we have to remind ourselves this right now. Sometimes it looks really eerie. Certain countries, maybe we'll get nuclear capabilities soon. What's going to happen? What's going to be if? I agree. Very unsettling. Flip to the last chapter. We know that's great. So it might be difficult for a certain time, but we're going to get to the end game, just like they got to the end game, and Revach Vatal Ya'amod. It's going to come. It's going to come. And that's a deep amunah that Mordechai lived with. Maybe this is a little silly of me. I want to share with you something I came across. I thought it was very beautiful in terms of really, this is such an analogy for the Purim story and why we have to read it twice, because we have to connect the dots between all the little places that happen as the story is being written. So this is part of a speech that Steve Jobs gave at Stanford University, a commencement speech. Okay? So he says like this: I'm honored to be with you today at your commencement from one of the finest universities in the world. He says, I never graduated from college. Truth be told, this is the closest I've ever gotten to college graduation, because he's standing with the graduates. So, right? Today I want to tell you 3 stories. I'm just going to share with you one of them. Don't worry. Okay. So he says the first story is about connecting the dots. I dropped out of Reed College after the first 6 months, but then stayed around as a drop-in for another 18 months or so before I really quit. So why did I drop out? It started before I was born. My biological mother was young, unwed, college graduate student. She decided to put me up for adoption. She felt very strongly that I should be adopted by college graduates, so everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer and his wife. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute they really wanted a girl, right? So my parents, who were on a waiting list, got a call in the middle of the night asking, we have an unexpected baby boy. Do you want him? They said, of course. My biological mother later found out that my mother had never graduated from college, that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused to sign the final adoption paper. She only relented a few months later when my parents promised that I would someday go to college. After 17 years, I did go to college, but I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford. And all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was spending all the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it will all work out. Okay, it was pretty scary at the time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked interesting. It wasn't all romantic. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in a friend's room. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with it. I would take a walk. I would walk 7 miles across town every night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give an example. He goes on to describe how he took a calligraphy course and he learned about sans serif and how it was revolutionary that what you see on the screen is pleasing to the eye. And this is when he was making the first computer. All that came back. And then he says, and since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have these nice calligraphy things. If I never dropped out, I would never have dropped in on this calligraphy class, which so much defined the technology that we live with today. And personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college. Nothing made sense then. But it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in the future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. Okay, so I have an extra whatever, right? God, Jewish destiny defined by the Nevi'im. This approach has never let me down and has made all the difference in my life. The lesson, I think, in the Megillah is the Megillah is a game of connecting the dots. It's a game of, it's really difficult in the moment. We don't know where things are going, but we have this emunah that we could flip to the last chapter and it will all make sense looking backwards. We'll be able to connect the dots of all the pains and all difficulties we've had this past year and a half. It'll all make sense one day. And that's what the emunah comes from. The emunah comes from having that last chapter to look at and knowing that it'll all ravel up into utopia, because we see that in the Nevi'im. Okay, that's the second. So the first one was the concept of Jewish unity, Achdus being the make it or break it for Am Yisrael. The second one is this concept of connecting the dots and this concept to be able to always look into the last chapter. And we have that last chapter available due to our emunah, due to our faith. The last topic, which is the topic of changing the world and looking beyond our comfort zones, challenging the status quo because the world is changing. And I think this is maybe the theme out of all of them that requires the most education in terms of appreciating not necessarily the story of Mordechai and Esther in a vacuum, but understanding what was going on in history at that time and realizing that there's like the narrative and the sub-narrative that are equally as important as one another. So what happened just before Achashverosh? Who was the king before Achashverosh? Anyone know? Huh? Oh, that was right after. Very important too. We'll get there. Koresh. The second Rashi, the first or the second Rashi, you'll check later, on Megillah Esther, says Achashverosh came right after Koresh. Okay? Fine. So that's what Rashi clarifies. Now, Koresh was, now let me give you an example of the Nevi'im predicting the future. Okay? This is in Yirmiyah, right? Yirmiyah Navi was way before the story of Purim. Okay? And Yirmiyah says in chapter Chafhei, Perak Chafhei, chapter 25, he says like this: V'haisa kol ha'aretz hazos lecharva, lishama. If you guys continue behaving this way, the prophet is telling the Jewish people, things are going to be really, really bad. And this whole beautiful city this whole beautiful land referring to Israel is going to be destroyed. Va'avdu hagoyim ha'ela es melech Bavel shivim shana. And this nation, the Jewish people, will be subservient to the Melech Bavel for 70 years. How long was it in between the first and second Beis HaMikdash? 70 years, right? This is hundreds of years we're predicting what's going to happen, and it happened to the T, right? V'haya kimulos shivim shana. When 70 years ticks, efkod al Melech Bavel, I'm going to inspire the king of Bavel, ve'al hagoy hahu ne'um Hashem, and the nation around you, v'samti oso l'shimos olam, and you're going to be able to start rebuilding after 70 years. So you're going to be 70 years under their rule. After 70 years, now I'm going to quote from Divrei Hayamim. After 70 years, Bishnas Achas LeKoresh Melech Pras, so the Persian Empire, which kind of emanated from the Babylonian Empire, in his first year of reign, Heir Hashem es Ruach Koresh. So he inspired Koresh, Melech Pras, to allow the Jewish people to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. So this is exactly how it was being predicted. And in the Nevi'im, hundreds of years happened exactly. 70 years, that's what it lasts. And after 70 years, a new king came around and allowed the Jewish people to come back to Israel and to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. Who was in charge at galvanizing the Jewish people to get back to Israel and to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash? None other than Ezra and Nehemiah. I'll give you credit for that. Ezra and Nehemiah together. Did the Jewish people do a good job at listening to Ezra to come back to Israel? Horrible job. Not good. And there was even a time that Ezra, we know this from Sefer Ezra, right? He's telling the Jewish people, okay, we have permission to rebuild, right? Under their empire. It's not going to be our sovereign state like we have today. We'll be able to build a Beis HaMikdash. We don't have enough people committed to my plan to function a Beis HaMikdash. Even if we get it built, there's not enough of you people coming back from Persia to join me over here in Israel, right? So it was bad because the Jewish people weren't listening to that call. In comes, so now, during this time, this is incredible. People, I think, don't appreciate the larger context of the story of Mordechai and Haman, Mordechai and Esther. At the time, the locals who were living in Israel at the time, they were incredibly unhappy with Koresh. You're letting these Jews in, and they're building, they're colonizers, they don't belong here, this is our land. Sounds familiar, right? From the river to the sea, right? The Persian Empire will be free, right? That's what they were saying. The Jews don't belong here. And this was a very heated debate, a political debate between the advisors of Koresh. Was he doing the right thing? Was he doing the wrong thing? So he devised a plan. Each side pick essentially a lawyer, a spokesman, an advocate for the anti-Jewish party, that we shouldn't allow the Jews to rebuild, we shouldn't allow the Jews back to Israel, or the Jewish party, the Zionist party, that we have a responsibility to allow these people back into their land, the previous iteration of our Malchus, of our empire, destroyed their base of Mikdash. They're good people. They help society. Let's let them back in. We're still going to be in charge, but we'll give them zoning license to build a religious temple. Right? That was a political debate. Guess who? This is significantly before the Purim story. This is before Achashverosh came to the scene. Guess who the advocates on either side that were chosen? I'll read it to you from the Medrash. Bir Haim, them, as Haman, V'Yisrael baru es Mordechai. And the Jewish people chose Mordechai. Right? So the Medrash says that Ketata Keduma Haisa B'neihem. There's a Medrash on the pasuk that Mordechai wouldn't bow down, and Haman went ballistic. I'm going to annihilate all the Jews. So the imagery that we have from kindergarten is Haman is this immature guy with a quick fuse, and everyone was bowing down to him except for Mordechai, and he couldn't go to sleep that night, so he's going to kill all the Jews. A little crazy of an image. This makes a whole different picture of the story of the Megillah. That no, Ketata Keduma Haisa B'neihem. This is old. What's it called? Old beef, right? This is like an old disagreement. Because years ago, before Achashverosh was king, they were in court against each other, fighting whether or not the Jews should be allowed or not. And guess who won? Mordechai won. So how does Haman feel? Years later, he's got to get one up. He lost last time. He's not going to lose this time. So okay, the Jews so they get permission to rebuild, thanks to Mordechai as their advocate, and no one listens to Ezra. A small minority listen to Ezra to go back to Israel. Everyone else is too comfortable in Persia, too comfortable in the diaspora. Now we think, so then we lose our chance because Achashverosh comes, and the first executive order that Achashverosh signs, right? The first is to take away the license for the Jews to go back and the Jews to rebuild. Everything Mordechai worked for under Koresh was, the carpet was pulled under our legs. No longer, and now we're thinking, we would have gone. Right when it's too late, and we weren't going, when Ezra was telling us, hey, we have permission to rebuild, and now Achashverosh comes, Haman is second in command, convinces when Mordechai doesn't bow down to him, it's his chance to really get him back. It's all the sub-narrative, and now he convinces Achashverosh that the Jews are evil, Jews are bad. So then he says, okay, let's wipe out all the Jews, and no more temple, no more Israel for you guys. That's literally the context of the story of the Megillah. Unbelievable, right? Unbelievable. So now we think of this, how could it be that the Jews wouldn't listen to Ezra? Amil, I could pick on you because you're my colleague, right? Would you listen to Ezra if he says, come, let's build the second base of Mikdash? I would like to think yes. Would you listen to Ezra? Or would you stay here in Kotzei Luke? Right?
We're staying.
Exactly. And we're having this conversation in Montreal. Okay, arguably, a very easy argument to make, our opportunity now to live in Israel is way better and way more promising than it was then. Okay, we don't have someone saying, guys, come, help us lay the brick of the base of Mikdash. But Ezra wasn't offering a sovereign Israel with an IDF to defend herself against enemies and Tudat Zehut and a passport that has Israeli flag. He wasn't offering any of that. He was offering brick and mortar zoning laws to build the base of Mikdash and have like a little Jewish town of 45, 50,000 Jews just around the base of Mikdash. That's what he was offering, right? So we don't have the base of Mikdash offer now, but we have, I think, a more. I think Nefesh B'Nefesh would rather have what they have now than try to pitch Ezra's pitch. I think it's better for them, right? And we're not there. So I think the second takeaway from the entire context of the Megillah, because the larger context of the Megillah is Jews not going to Israel and then losing the opportunity to go to Israel. I think it is really just, in some circles it's like a controversial thing to say, but I'm a strong believer that every Jew should have a reason why they don't live in Israel if you don't live in Israel. And there's good reasons. The kids are all here, it's too hard, education, it's not practical, and there's a lot of legitimate reasons, but it's important to legitimize those reasons to yourself and to remember that we're here for a reason. But it's like taking, if I take something on an elastic band and I'm pulling it, so it's not there, it's here. Okay, so why is it here? There's a reason why it's here, because I'm holding it here. But when I let go of that reason, it's going to go back there. And that's how we have to feel about Israel, especially now when it's the greatest opportunity in history to be there. And we, myself included, we're not there, we're here. So what's your reason? I think that's a huge takeaway from living through Purim this year, especially because with what we're going on counterintuitively, we all want to be there even more because of what's going on. So that's something which is important to clarify for ourselves. Yes.
Were the Jews that were in Israel at that time, were they affected by the edicts of Ahasuerus?
Jews living where at the time?
In Israel.
Yes, they weren't allowed to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. So the whole reason why they went there was taken away from them. They went to rebuild.
No, what I mean is, were they going to be destroyed?
Oh, good question. I think it's debated. I don't have a clear answer for you off that. Yeah. Now, to that note, this is about questioning our comforts, right? Going out of our comfort zones. And we're going to talk about how Mordechai and Esther did this individually in just a minute. It's on a national level. In the time of Purim, we weren't willing to question our comfort zones. We were too comfortable. They were too comfortable. That generation was too comfortable in Purim. And by the way, parenthetically, why was it such a bad thing that the Jews went to the Seuda of Achashverosh, right? Why was it so bad? Right? In the Megillah, we read certain things in the tune of Eicha. You know why we do that? So they say we read it in the tune of Eicha, so even the Litvaks could have some simcha, joy on Purim. That's what they say, right? But the real reason is every pasuk we read in the tune of Eicha has a reason. And one of them is when he was setting up the Seuda in the first chapter that all the Jews went to, it says that he brought out Kelim Shonim. Kelim Shonim, right? Why do we read in a sad tune? The Gemara tells us that as a stick it to you, he took all the vessels that they were going to use in Jerusalem to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, and he put them out for display in Persia to decorate his party. It was a celebration of Jews. You can't have the Beis Hamikdash, and we went to that because we're kind of happy. Now we're not guilty that Ezra, that big tzaddik over there, is telling us to go to rebuild. Now the project's it's not happening, so we could let go. That train left, and we could recomfort ourselves here. We could build extension in our house, so to speak. Right? They were really happy. They didn't want to go, so now the reason is gone. So they were happy, and they all joined. That's a very bad thing. Oh, that's a whole different context. Now we understand why the Gzeir, the edict against the Jewish people from God, to be annihilated because it was such a bad. Like the Gemara says, why did this whole story happen to the Jewish people? Because they went to the Seuda of Achashverosh. Come on, it's not so bad. But with this larger narrative, this larger picture, it is so bad. It really is bad because they are celebrating with Achashverosh not being able to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, and the very thing that they were supposed to be celebrating in the times of Koresh, they were now celebrating that they didn't have that reason to celebrate anymore. So it's really bad. Okay, just about this idea of reasons to be here, and questioning our comfort zones. So I shared this one time actually. I don't know if you remember when I shared this when I came to visit Montreal to test you guys out. That's why I came, right? And this is something I hold very close to my heart. It's on display in my house, and this was a gift given by my community in Yerushalayim. The last Shabbos that we were there before we moved to Edmonton, they made a little goodbye Sudat Preda on a Shabbos. So they gave this to me and Penina. I'll read it to you. It's very beautiful. He says, "Ma'isa be'echad sheyatzeh miYerushalayim l'chutz la'aretz." This is a story of someone who left from Jerusalem to chutz la'aretz. Okay, Amru lo, they said to him, "Harei gazru she'ein yotzim chutz Yerushalayim l'chutz la'aretz al achas kama v'kama." The rabbi said you're not allowed to. If you're living in Jerusalem, you can't leave. All the more so, you can't leave Israel. You can't leave. So Amr Lahem says the individual was justifying his leaving Israel. And he says, Nit kaneti b'menei chutz la'aretz. I was always jealous of the people who lived outside of Israel. My whole life I lived in Jerusalem. I'm jealous of the people who live out. Shehem mitga'agim liYerushalayim. Because they're yearning for Jerusalem. Va'ani lo ta'amti tam ga'aguim eila. I never tasted the taste of that yearning. Eitzei, I'll leave. Ve'eda tam ga'aguim liYerushalayim. Just so I could feel that yearn. That's why I want to leave. So then, hitiru lo latzes, they allowed him to leave. Al menat, on condition, sheyisaper b'shvacha shel Yerushalayim. That their mission statement outside of Israel is tell people how amazing it is over here. So this is a good reason to be here. If you have a shlichus, if you have advocacy, and you have people that you're affecting around you, your family, your colleagues, there are reasons to pull the elastic here. But it's important to know that there's a reason that's holding you here. And once that reason lets go, when Ezra calls us, we're not going to make the same mistake that generation made. We're going to go back. Yes?
Was there a big aliyah after the Purim story?
Good. So after, who is the king after Achashverosh? Daryavish. That's when the Beis Hamikdash got rebuilt.
But did many people go? Many people stayed behind? Like what?
It was significant. I don't know the exact numbers, but when Ezra finally settled, there was 24,000. I believe that was the number. But then more and more people came once it was established. Yeah. By the way, Chazal tell us who was Daryavish, who was his mother, who was his father. Esther and Achashverosh. So as a direct result for their bravery and their advocacy, they literally put the temple project back on the table, and it actually happened because of Esther, right? Mom, what do you think? The Jews want to rebuild. What should they do? Daryavish, I think you should let them do it. Okay, Mom says yes. That's how it happened. That's how it happened. It's such a, we're told the story, and again, the whole game of the Megillah is to see past the superficiality. So understanding the historical context, that Achashverosh, there was a Koresh before, a Daryavish after, what the talking points were politically about the Jewish people, about them rebuilding. In the times of Koresh, Achashverosh took it away. And the story of Purim was getting Achashverosh to put that back on the table. And okay, he allowed the Jews to defend ourselves, and then the next king allowed us to go back and rebuild. This is all, while this is happening, Ezra was in Israel, watching this from afar, waiting to get the zoning license from the empire to rebuild. It's an incredible perspective to understand. Again, this is the only story that we celebrate of the Jews outside of Israel. Right? Pesach, we're on our way to Israel. Sukkot, we're on our way to Israel. That all happened in the first generation. Hanukkah happened in Israel. This is the only story that we celebrate of a Jewish community outside of Israel. And guess what the story is about? Going back to Israel. And failing, and then the rupture, and then the recovery of our willingness to be as brave as Mordechai and Esther in terms of going back to Israel. That's literally the larger narrative, the context of Mordechai and Esther. It's pretty unbelievable. So the Jewish people at the beginning refused to go outside the comfort zones, and at the end, that's what they were willing to do. You see the same thing in the protagonists themselves, in Mordechai and Esther, namely. Okay, it really, when I was building this relationship, and I still have the relationship, we have the relationship with the soldier that came on Shmini Atzeres, Elkanah Cohen. So he stayed at my house a little bit, and he was talking. We still talk, and he's just like such a gentle person. He's so kind, and he's such a gentle person. And when we went to Israel last year, we met all these elite soldiers. He's like these military warriors, right? Wouldn't want to meet them in a dark alley if I was their enemy. They're just, you look at their eyes and they're just filled with softness and kindness, and they're gentle. And you could tell what they're trained to do isn't who they naturally are, but they need to do it, and they do it. And it's very, very inspiring. For many years I thought, what are comfort zones in life? Is you could argue that my comfort zone is Hashem telling me, God telling me, this is what you're good at, stay within them, because that's what you're comfortable doing. But I really believe, developed in life since then, and I've seen it so many times with myself, with other people, that comfort zones are meant to be challenged. If you challenge them too much too quickly, you'll have too much anxiety, you won't be able to do it. But if you always play the game just outside your comfort zone, you won't recognize yourself 5 years later. Things that you were crippled to do, you could do comfortably without even getting nervous at all. If you're constantly saying, this is my comfort zone, I'm going to live just outside of it, always put an expansive. And I think that's exactly the story of all these soldiers that we see. And that's exactly the story of Mordechai and Esther. Who was Mordechai before he was remembered in history? He was the leading halachic authority in Shushan. He was on the Sanhedrin. He was respected. If you had a question in halacha, if you need guidance in life, you go to find him in the Beit Midrash, and you sit next to him, and he quietly tells you what he thinks guidance halacha. He wasn't this charismatic advocate. He just wasn't. In fact, I'll tell you, very shocking Gemara. Humorous, in fact. At the end of the Megillah, it says, Ki Mordechai Yehudi Mishnah Lamelech Achashverosh V'gadol Yehudim V'ratzoi, who is beloved and accepted by Rov Echav, which means the majority of the Jewish people, right? Who here is going to see Mordechai after what he did and say, I'm not into this guy? I mean, he's a hero. It should be V'ratzoi Le'echav, L'kol Echav, Rov Echav. So who's that? It's clearly excluding something. The simple understanding in the pasuk, in the verse, it's some people didn't receive Mordechai after this whole story. Who were those people? And the Gemara in Megillah tells us something which is mind-boggling. He says, v'lo kol echad malamed shepirshu mimenu miktas Sanhedrin lefi shenasa karov lemachos ubito mitalmudo. He wasn't learning as much as he used to. He wasn't as much of a scholar. He's now rubbing shoulders with high society, with the presidents, with the prime ministers, with the MPs, with the members of, and with Achashverosh, with Haman. He was like in parliament now, doing Jewish advocacy. He's not a rabbi anymore. Right? He's not one of us. His old colleagues, rabbinic colleagues in the Sanhedrin, were the ones that didn't accept him anymore. So he had this life of, I am a rabbi, halachic authority, I'm on the Beis Din, and he cut ties to completely transform himself because it was needed. There was no one else doing it. And he realized that God wanted him to do something very different than he'd been doing for his whole life. It wasn't within his comfort zones, but he redefined what his comfort zone was. And suddenly he was sneaking up behind the palace and eavesdropping in different languages and intercepting messages and doing all these crazy covert things and hanging out by where all the women were being kept, just to check on his nephew, his niece, Hadassah or Esther, like doing all these wild things when he was used to just sitting and learning Gemara and Halacha and making sure he knew the answer to all the very sophisticated legal questions that Jews have. That's who he was. He redefined himself because that's what was needed. With Esther as well, going back to that original scene that we've gone back to already a few times. The first time Mordechai says, this is up to you, you go do it. What did she say? I can't, I'll get killed. Who's she thinking of? She's herself. She's just trying to protect herself. She was caught in this cobweb, this crazy circumstances where all of us, she finds herself winning a beauty pageant and now she's the queen of the most powerful guy in the world. She's like trying to figure this all out. She's trying to stay clear of any trouble. And Mordechai shifts her perspective to a lot bigger picture and convinces her that, no, you're a protagonist in Jewish history right now to save the Jewish people. So she says, yeah, I'll do it. I'll step into this new role. Completely not what she expected. No one trained her for this. She wasn't from a family of advocates. And I think the story of Mordechai and Esther also tells us, like I mentioned before, to try to see ourselves in them. And what could we do? And instead of, talking to ourselves and say, well, what am I good at? To add to the community, to add to the Jewish people, ask yourself what needs to be done. And if you could be the one who identifies what needs to be done, yeah, but it's not my thing, ignore that voice and do it anyways. Take on initiative in the community, a learning initiative, a davening initiative, a social, anything within to uplift the community, to uplift the Jewish people. If we ask ourselves a little bit less, what am I good at? And let me do something like that. Ask ourselves more what's needed. And then do that instead. Even if it's not something we think we're good at. That's what Mordechai did. That's what Esther did. On a national level, that was our mistake by not being able to leave our comfort zone. I think that's a major theme in the Megillah as well. So again, based on our current realities, we touched on a few things. The importance of Jewish unity, the importance of having that emunah, that last chapter in the book, to be able to connect the dots in past tense. We know that we can't connect them now. We don't know how we're going to get there, but we'll be able to connect the dots one day. And that's the essence of the emunah, the faith, that the Megillah is asking us to have. And lastly, that this whole narrative is really about Israel, about our connection to Israel, about our willingness to expand and be able to live, flourish